Okay, let me kick off the Q&A, maybe with a question to Alysha. Right, I was very intrigued by your point that there are some, what do you call, existential questions facing Nimbus, and if I could sort of sum up in my own way what I figure you communicated, it was that you want to be broad enough to include as many diverse players as possible. At the same time, you want to preserve some kind of clear core principles, right? So that not just any influencer ends up as part of your network. How's that going? Can you maybe give us an indication of the kind of question that is quite fraught? How do you define insiders and outsiders? Can you give us an example of that?
So I think we've put a pause on admitting new members precisely because we kind of have this problem, and we also need to together with the members that we do have, figure out these sorts of definitions. But one approach that, like, rather than saying like independent media is media that publishes like X number of times a week on like these particular platforms, we're also thinking about a sort of values-based approach, and maybe what an independent media is doesn't have to be like based on like regularity or platform, but rather the ethos of their work and what they try to shed light on. And I think because of precisely because our scene is so broad, and because we want to include these issue-led advocacy organizations, arts groups, and so on, we have to structure it this way. Like, there cannot be a one-size-fits-all approach.
Questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, Amy Sim. I'm just interested, because Nimbus consists of media, but as well as advocacy groups. So I'm interested in where do you draw the line between media and advocacy? In the work I do, we support a lot of environmental journalism, and we actually make this point that we actually draw a line between journalism and advocacy, because I think they serve different purposes. And I also question in Singapore whether that is a good strategy, because advocacy groups get labeled in a certain way or get discredited. If the advocacy mission, the goal is maybe not totally aligned with the main narratives. So that's the second question, whether that's a good strategy. And then finally, how do you reach a wider audience? Because I went to the festival last year and I was really touched, because as a Singaporean, when I go to regional conferences on civil society, Singapore is always very poorly represented, and I feel sad for the state of our civil society compared to our neighbors who are really, really vibrant. So I also wonder, how do you reach out to the wider audience? Because I think people who are here today, we are the converted, we are somewhat, free-spirited. But how do you reach out to a lot more others who may not be reading these media? Thank you.
Okay. Since this is supposed to be a very participatory conference, I'm going to be very sneaky, Amy, and actually ask you to answer the first two questions yourself. Because it does sound, you said that you've actually thought about this in your organization. So where to you is that line between media and advocacy? What's your preliminary or fully formed thoughts on that subject?
I wouldn't say that my thoughts are fully formed. It's something that I question myself every day, and I think about this question a lot. So I work in an international organization called Internews, and we support independent media. We also look at information more broadly, just not from the media space, but from other people who provide access to information and the ways to get information to the general public. I do find that for advocacy groups, because they have a very clear agenda, people would access that information from that understanding, from the perspective that I am accessing information with a very clear agenda. Whereas if you're looking at media, I'm reading the news every day. Of course, no journalist is totally impartial, but the practice of journalism requires journalists to provide different opinions, to come up with a balanced story. And as a reader, I would have less suspicions on the agenda of the news that I'm reading. Not saying that there isn't any, but I would take it from a more kind of, from the perspective that I'm looking at something that is meant to be providing information for the public good.
So, reading into your answer, I pick up two things, right? One is that it's a question of where you're coming from, your agenda, so to speak, what's driving you. The second, though, is a sort of a methodological question, which is how do I do the thing? How do I do journalism? How do I do science and so on? These could actually be treated separately, right? So it is possible for any person, whether it's a journalist or a researcher and so on, to have very deep religious, ideological convictions, etc., but still apply a certain methodology that makes their work appear and be as fair, as balanced as possible, right? I wonder if, before I turn to Alysha, I wonder if Kirsten have any thoughts on that. Because I see you as very much in that space. You're not apologetic about your convictions. You have very clear alliances with certain groups. And yet, most of your work, when you are being a journalist, is identifiably professional journalism.
Yeah, I think there is there is a difference between whether a journalist is a neutral figure, which I don't think exists, and whether a journalist is professional. And so like, for instance, I personally do not write reports on the death penalty because I'm so embedded in the movement that I am not comfortable, and I would actually tell editors this. I don't do news reports on death penalty. I only write commentary and features, and in the feature I will work into the story that I am an activist so that people who are reading it are aware that the writer is coming from this angle, right? So to me that's a very clear method sort of thing. And I think and for me, the more I do this, the more I also realize that in Singapore, who gets to define what is journalism and what is advocacy is extremely political. And I think that happens in academia as well, right? You can be doing research and suddenly they're like, oh, your research a bit activist. What is your agenda? You are supposed to just be an academic. How come you believe in things? And I think that becomes very problematic, because I see a lot of stories in the Straits Times that I think is very dictated by agenda and very dictated by a particular view as well.
But it's the right agenda.
But it's presented as unquestionable journalism. Whereas if you become a little bit more critical, then they're like, oh, that's not journalism anymore. That's advocacy. So I think it becomes very fraught, and it would be much better if audiences and readers were actually trained to recognize this political reality and pass what they are reading and assessing, rather than thinking, oh, if it comes from news website, there must be news. If it comes from NGO website, there must be advocacy. And one is more trustworthy than the other inherently, because I think we are seeing a lot now, not just in Singapore, but around the world, a lot of realization that even established news media outlets might not be as objective and correct. There's a lot of reporting that's not necessarily malicious, but also incredibly colored by the newspaper's editorial direction, the newspaper's political position, the country that the newspaper is from, the sources that they prefer, and that also presents a very particular agenda, right? It's very recognized among the journalism industry that very often established news outlets tend to favor authority sources. So government press releases are preferred over some small collective that's only on Instagram, right? The government source is seen as more legit. Then what happens if the government is lying to you? What happens if you go to a Trump press conference and he's just plain lying to you? But then he's the president, so somehow that means we must amplify what he says. And you know, so that creates a lot of, I think, need for us to not see this and to be more critical of everything that we're seeing. And I think as somebody who's like a member of Nimbus, I think also it's one of those things where if one of the things that Nimbus wants to look at is media freedom, then nobody is going to be activists for media freedom if media workers are not activists for media freedom. You know, you can't sit there and go like, oh, press freedom is very bad, but nobody's saying anything. And I need everyone else to say something because I'm being neutral in the thing that affects my own life and my own rights bowl, right? So like, I think there's a lot of journalists don't have to be activists, and in certain cases shouldn't be activists, but on press freedom, journalists need to be the first line of activism.
Thanks, Kirsten. And thank you for your question, Amy. I don't think that with Nimbus, we want to construe activist groups as journalists or the other way around. We're not trying to launder each group into each other. And I don't think those groups want it either. I think there's a reason why advocacy groups self-identify as such, and there's a reason why journalists self-identify as such. And I think for both groups, there's benefits and drawbacks to each of these labels and how they move about in the spaces they move in. And like Kirsten said, like the journalistic standards are also very subjective and, you know, and also determined by this landscape that we are in. And in some ways, it could also be more of a hindrance for certain groups to then adopt those standards. But where Nimbus comes in is this kind of like messy middle where some of these advocacy groups are producing journalistic work and they are filling in gaps in knowledge. And we want to recognize and we want to nurture that work without constricting these groups. And that's something that we are working through and figuring out how to do. And on your second question about reach and reaching different audiences, I think that's where the power of the network comes in, and that's where everyone's different audiences can kind of build off of each other. I think obviously there's like a lot of overlap in Singapore, like the fact that a lot of Nimbus members are in this room shows that there's a similar audience for these things. But I think there's also like kind of a black hole effect. Like the more people come together, like the more they draw in, you know, people like you who perhaps come to the conference because there's like 20 groups as opposed to one group presenting. So that's how we hope to grow it.
Okay. Question or comment from Kokila and then from Elvin.
Hi, I just wanted to make a contribution kind of connected to the first question. I think we're in a media environment where a lot of independent organizations or advocacy groups have to be journalists, right? Like so there's a lot of instances where TJC is the news source. Like we are the news source when there's an execution. We are the news source when 36 death row prisoners bring a case to sue the AGC, you know, which are really newsworthy stories and would be undoubtedly published in many other places, but because we never get responses to press releases, no local media will show up to our press conferences, maybe except Kirsten and Ariffin. And the Kirsten's and TJC is also a bit complicated. So then we're the news source, right? And I think it also puts us in a difficult position sometimes where as activists or as organizers, you need to be journalists, you need to be lawyers. I mean, we have close to 0 human rights lawyers left, and a lot of us have to teach ourselves the law. You need to be researchers, and because there's not enough infrastructure to support civil society work that is truly independent or resourced. And I think it results in this problem where there's a lot of fragmented news, right? Like you need to go to SG Climate Routes to get some kinds of news about like sand theft. You need to go to TJC's page to get news about the criminal punishment system. You need to go to like Workers Make Possible page to learn about labor news. And this is a problem. And I think that's where platforms like Kirsten's and Ariffin's, where they amplify and bring together, become really powerful and useful. And while I have the mic, I just want to shout out that it would have been impossible to shift the needle on the death penalty conversation in Singapore without Wake Up Singapore and the way that they supported the story about Nagin and Kalwant. And it really changed the national discourse and made it a national conversation. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the power that even with almost no resources, these platforms can have when they act with conviction. So thank you.
Thanks, that was great. Elvin?
Hi. I would just like to follow a little bit on the previous questions that were being put to Alysha for Nimbus as well, similar to what Cherian was mentioning. So the first one is a question, and the second one is a bit more of a comment. So the first question is, you mentioned that Nimbus is kind of an advocacy organization, a collective looking to advocate for independent media. So I'm curious, could you maybe elaborate a bit more about like what is it advocating for the independent media? Like, obviously, my assumption would be you want to advocate for some change, and so is there any clarity on what kind of change would the collective be focusing on? Number two is more of a comment. You mentioned that the collective is still growing, is still finding its own foot, and there is some sense that you might want to focus on like maybe making it a value-based collective or a ethos-based collective. I believe those were the words you mentioned. I can definitely see some benefits to that to make the kind of objective organization much more clearer. But I was also wondering there might be some cost, right, to making the organization and the audience, basically audience of the organization much more narrower, as the previous commentator mentioned. And let's just put it simply, right? The government may just see you as a bunch of troublemakers, and then therefore just ignore you, right? And so on the flip side, I'm thinking what are the potential costs and benefits of being a more inclusive collective. So hypothetically, for example, if independent media includes, say, your kind of more contemporary content creation, Petir, fine, but more content creators, right? I don't know, like SGAG, the Smart Local, Overkill, Online Citizen, maybe a Mothership, right? That being a bit more inclusive, I guess definitely has its cost, but also might have potential benefits to, I don't know, providing more credibility that you are advocating for so-called everyone in the independent media space and not just for a niche group, right? So I'm just wondering if you can
Question for
walk
Alysha.
through.
Yeah.
So back to the first question about what we are advocating for. So to clarify, we are not an advocacy group. We are a network. And so we are led by the members in our network. And so who we are advocating for are the members. So our members' interests are by extension our interests. And of course that becomes difficult to, of course with the diversity of members that becomes challenging, but I think really what we are looking out for is like press freedom and the rights for our members to do the work that they do. And so when that becomes challenged, then I think it is the job of the network to stand together and to stand in solidarity and to support other members as best as they can. And I hope that answers the question. And then on your second point, thank you for the comment. And I agree that we, as much as we want to be, we want to be values-led, but also inclusive. And I don't think that, and I wasn't specific about the values that I was imagining, but I don't think those would be specific issue-based values, and I don't think that we can function like that. I was talking about values of like freedom of speech and stuff that that concerns media specifically, and I think that but also just to clarify, I don't think our network's goal is to directly engage with the government. That's not really something that we are looking at right now. I think we are not looking to strategically position ourselves in like a very moderate way, in terms of our membership.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Actually, it also relates to something Amy had brought up earlier, which again touches on this dilemma that probably everyone in the room faces, right? How do you deal with an existing political culture that is hegemonic, right? That regards even mild activism as anti-national, well, maybe not anti-national, but troublesome, stronger activism as anti-national. Do you then kind of admit that, well, that's hegemonic and therefore you have to adapt your branding and your positioning accordingly, try to appear as moderate as possible, adjust your language so that it's less alarming to our very thin-skinned elites, yeah? Or alternatively, do you just say, no, heck it, time is on our side? These thin-skinned denizens of our society will ultimately be extinct because they are not able to win the Darwinian competition for survival, and so we're just going to forget about it. We're just going to forget about trying to be palatable to the government. We may want, of course, to stay within the law. Right? We want to stay within the law, but we don't go out of our way to make our things that we say pleasant to their sensitive ears, right? So there are two very different strategies that we could take. And my guess, without having to poll you, is that you are actually, all three of you are on in the second side, right? You're not too worried about upsetting our delicate fellow citizens who get easily upset by things. You will observe the law, you'll try and keep out of trouble, but the kind of audience building that Elvin is talking about, you're not really worried about that, are you?
I think for me, I operate on a massive sunk cost fallacy in that they're angry already. So, I mean,
there's not much you can do about
yeah, I mean, if, I've already, 3 police investigations, they're already so angry, they already don't like, then why do you try to please them, right? So like, it's like the ERP 2.0, like I've already put in so much, die must roll out. I think it is true that we have different positionalities and like some have more access than others and we should all maintain that. But I think fundamentally there needs to be, it needs to operate on principles, right? So like if you have access to the authorities and have some opportunity to affect change in that way, that's very useful, but it cannot come at the cost of having pandered so much that like it actually becomes counterproductive.
Right. But anyway, a question at the back. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Siba. Big fan of all of you all, so thank you for being here today. You can hear me, right? Yeah, okay. So I guess my question, and in the backdrop, I just want to put there, like, have there been, in the backdrop, have there been incidents where you managed to get the government to, like, release information that it did not want to, right? So, for instance, now we take for granted that there's immigration policy seeks to maintain the racial balance, which initially the government did not want to admit in the 1990s, right? Like, that kind of shift, but that in the backdrop, my question is the relationship between ethos, framing, and the kind of issues that you cover at the margins, right? So in terms of the collective and sort of like being more umbrella, for me, it's like, Alysha, you spoke about ethos, right? And all of you, I think, if I could just try and maybe throw it out, being kind of presumptuous here, you're like anti-racist, anti-xenophobic, you care about inequality, you care about freedom of information, right? With this I don't think folks like Critical Spectator, Uncritical Spectator, or fabrications about PAP, or like all this other kind of alternative media, NAS Daily, fella disappeared already, can be part of this collective, right? So, and that moves to framing, right? Framing where sometimes y'all cover issues, death penalty, migrants, etc. that, like unlike housing, unlike immigration, and like, people taking our jobs might not speak to the broad-based average Singaporean. So how do you expand the frame, to bring, to sort of make people care about that? And given the difficulty of, getting access to information, having to use question marks versus full stop. Ariffin, you're very, very positive. I see the stuff my dad shares with me on WhatsApp. I'm scared to death. Right? And I would not want to just put 2 photos there and I have to go like that. No. You're not supposed to be racist or xenophobic here. The point we're trying to make is this, right? So how do you do that? So to summarize again, ethos, framing, and making some issues at the margin, right, sort of feasible to enter people's consciousness? Thank you.
The first question was, do you have any success stories to share on getting data and putting it out? Well, not just data, just information.
I think, for example, so the government used to not announce or acknowledge that executions happen. So it just happens, and then they don't even put out a statement. It's not reported that it's going to happen, and then it's not reported after it has happened, and nobody knows, right? So it's this very strange thing where they're like, oh, it's a deterrent, but we won't tell you when it's happening. So you just be deterred theoretically. What a lot of TJC's work has done is made visible. So we try as much as possible to put out a statement that this execution notice has been issued, the execution is going to happen. If we have consent, we'll name them and talk about their stories. If not, we at least just say a man has been issued a notice, and that also goes to media outlets. So the local mainstream media won't cover it, but we've had more kind of attention on social media because of Wake Up and other platforms. We've had international media, and because of this growing sort of pressure in when AFP and Reuters and like the Sydney Morning Herald and Washington Post are all calling CNB and the police and the prisons and going, we saw that TJC said this. So I think in 2022 onwards, they do more commonly, I don't think it's a hard and fast rule, but they do more commonly now issue statements to acknowledge that executions have happened, which is not great because the whole point is you want them to not execute, not just tell you when they have executed. But at least that kind of, it has shifted the expectations because now there are more Singaporeans going, hey, what's up with this? What is the government doing? And it increases the political cost of that silence. It has not yet increased it to a point where for example, that politicians want to talk to death row families or, bring in their petition to Parliament, but it has turned up the heat a little bit, yeah.
Thank you. And the second point, which is so important, is that we shouldn't forget, if I could rephrase your question, that the government power isn't the only obstacle that independent, critical media face. There's also resistance from the people, right, from the ground, yeah, and we haven't said much about that. And maybe I'll ask you this question, Ariffin, because among the three of you, you're the one that is, I guess, most reliant on popular channels. Yeah, and I'm sure you watch your hit rates and audience numbers and so on very, very carefully. And my guess is that you've observed that there are different kinds of critical story you could do, right? There are those that are effectively clickbait because they touch on certain nerves, whether it's property prices or whatever. And there are others that are probably, in fact, more important, but actually may not be very popular causes, like the death penalty. How do you think through these different kinds of stories?
Sometimes the things that you put a lot of thought into doesn't get much hits. And something you just come up with in 2 minutes will go viral, right? So I think sometimes the thing is that when you have a very important piece of work out there, be it from TJC, from another organization or whatnot, sometimes we also have to think about how we repackage it for mass appeal. Sometimes, yeah, it's clickbaity and whatnot, but we're just trying to get different buy-ins, different sort of hooks for different sort of people. And I mean, sometimes we're not really guided by the numbers, but the numbers are important. And I mean, to go back to the question, right, sometimes because the government, when they do change things, right, they will never say that, oh, it's because of Kirsten's article, it's because of Wake Up Singapore, it's because of TJC or whatnot, right? They will say that, oh, we have reviewed internally, we have discussed, and, we have come to, they will use their little buzzwords. But the thing is this, we have to realize that a lot of times, right, I think the most recent example is the Simply Go saga, or maybe soon the OBU LTA unit, and even the Tudong issue in the past and whatnot. A lot of times it's groundswell from Facebook comments and things like that. And what sometimes we do is we just compile these things and put them together, right? So it's not really because of any of our publication as a success story, but it's really like the people voicing out their concerns, and once they realize that, okay, look, I mean, I'm sure they got their own senses and whatnot lah. Yeah, that's about it.
Have there been instances where you've published what you believe to be the right thing, but the blowback from the public has been quite significant and kind of jolted you into wondering whether you should be doing something else?
In a sense, sometimes, yeah. Like, I mean, because we have our audience on Instagram. I'm talking about Wake Up's perspective, right? We got audience on Instagram, we got audience on Facebook, right? So if we post something, let's say in relation to gay marriage, Instagram will be like, yeah, well done, woohoo, whatnot, right? Facebook, like everyone will come out and say, you know, so like, like God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, you know, this kind of this kind of things lah. So like, so sometimes I realize that we have to, let's say we are publishing some survey results, right? We have to word the title in a way where both the homophobes and the allies will click.
Wow, okay.
You know, like we have to pitch or angle things in such a way where like, and I think sometimes, especially like for example with the recent war in Gaza, right? People are extra sensitive to words that you use, right? Whether you neutralize, you murder, you kill or whatnot. So people are very sensitive to the words that you use, the images that you use, even the URL links, how you frame certain things, where you put certain things. Like, do you put a certain source at the top of the story or the bottom of the story? Things like that. People are becoming more critical about these things, which I think is good, and I hope sometimes the critical lens can be extended to our local context as well.
Right. That's a great answer. Thank you. Other question? Yes, Rachel. George.
Testing. All right. I actually wanted to follow up something related to the discussion about sort of the clickbaity stuff, because that's something I've been observing. Because I teach, I often ask my undergrads, because I teach the political science department at NUS, how they consume their media, and I've increasingly been finding that one of the biggest sources is TikTok and Reddit. Two of the biggest sources are TikTok and Reddit, and I was wondering what. Obviously, as academics, we tend to bemoan the fall in long form. I was wondering whether, you know, as practitioners, media practitioners, you also think, I mean, you obviously have been thinking about this. Obviously Facebook and Instagram, but also the rise of TikTok and how that changes the way media is consumed. Because obviously there can be clickbait, and hopefully that will lead to people going towards the long form. But that doesn't always happen, especially certain social media sites just don't lead you there. So TikTok is not the greatest, has not been the greatest kind of direction or nudger towards the long form. I was wondering how, say, I mean, Kirsten tends to do a lot more long form, and I saw obviously within the Nimbus as well, sort of sites like JOM are very long form sometimes, which is great. I love it, but when I assign to my undergrads, they're like, oh, this is 5,000 words. No. So it's been something that I've been thinking about, and I'm wondering what some strategies you've been thinking about, or is it just kind of going, well, not everybody's going to like long form, but I'm just going to write long form. So has that been something you've been thinking a little bit about for many of you, really?
Thank you. And George?
Thanks. So very quickly, I just want to get your sense. I mean, since the three of you have been in the media landscape in Singapore, just wanted to get a sense of, you know, think about 2 decades from now, right? What is your sense on Singapore's media landscape going to be like? How do you see your role in it or your place in it? And are you more optimistic or pessimistic about, you know, where we're heading towards? Yeah.
Okay, let me, since we just have 5 minutes, I'll use those as the closing questions and kind of allocate them. Maybe the short form, long form, TikTok versus JOM question. Actually, why do I let him off? Sudhir will answer that, right? Okay, Sudhir is going to answer that one, give you guys a break, and then let you guys focus on the future of journalism question from George. And I want to, I'll tag on to it, but first let's hear from Sudhir. By the way, I hope you all ticked your release form that coming here means that you can be freely arrowed at any kind.
No, yeah, I mean, so it's a perennial existential question, right? I mean, we like long form, we like the literary aspect of it, but you know, attention spans have been shortening for a whole bunch of reasons. new technologies and new media forms are a big part of the reason why attention spans have been shortening. Part of me thinks that attention spans will eventually rise up again once people rediscover the joy of reading, but maybe that won't happen. Maybe the trajectory will be very different towards more short-form video and things like that. So I think we have to figure out how to survive in that environment, and I think what Ariffin said earlier about having gateways is very important in terms of gateways to your long-form content, which we try to do on Instagram and other channels where we try to cut up our long-form content. I don't think we're doing a very good job of it yet. I think we can do a better job of it. And then in terms of formats and genres, what we also try to do, and this is also bridging the divide between your more literary forms of content and your more plain speaking, more accessible forms of content, which I've tried to do in the past and I will do again at the next election, is through video, right? So, I can have my 5,000 word essay, but when I actually convert that to a 5-minute video, you'll hear me in a very different register and tone and everything else, which is partly to try to make it more accessible. And thanks for the captions comment. We always fail to do that. We'll do that this time. So yeah, so I think it's playing with Gateway, playing with formats and genres and registers and tones in the different formats. But also I think just admitting and accepting that there is an existential crisis at the heart of all this because of these new technologies.
Thanks so much, Udhir. The final question is to the three of you, the future of media journalism in Singapore. How do you see it? I just want to tag on a couple of thoughts to that. One, the existential question that Sudhir referred to is often thought of as a technological question, but it's something more, isn't it? Technology may have accelerated it, but I think what many experts worry about is phenomena like just total news avoidance. People who feel that, I've just had enough of this. I'm going to tune out completely. No matter what format you give it, I'm just not interested in the news, number one. Secondly, there's a huge amount of, unfortunately, not just media literacy or criticism, but there's a huge amount of media cynicism. And I'm sure you've experienced that, where people just feeling, these days you can't trust anyone, right? Which means that everybody's equally bad. The good faith, investigative, serious journalists are as bad as Russian and Chinese propaganda, right? Because they're all tainted. How do you deal with that kind of cynicism, that kind of news avoidance? Obviously you still have hope that some better future is possible. So I'll leave that with the three of you to answer as any way you see fit.
Yeah, so I think first off, about the different platforms, I think it's not always an issue of editorial choice and philosophy. Sometimes it's also an issue of capacity. I write my newsletter because that's what I'm most skilled at, and that's the format that appeals to me, and I can do it. Whereas I cannot TikTok. Yeah. So it's not that I don't want to TikTok, I just cannot TikTok, right? I hate videoing. So if anybody has asked me this, I'm very sorry, but occasionally I get people who ask me, can you just film yourself talking to camera and then just send me a 30-second clip? And sometimes I feel very bad to say no, so I say we'll see, and then I will purposely miss the deadline until it becomes very moot, because I will procrastinate so much on doing it that it's actually easier to just not ask me. Because I hate it, right? I can't do it. So I think that's where a network like Nimbus becomes very valuable as well, because it offers us the opportunity to support each other and work together. So I am not on TikTok at all, but Wake Up is. And I don't have a problem if I've already, if I've already looked at all the news articles, I've already written the newsletter, I've already talked to people or done a story. I have no problem with Wake Up just taking it and adapting it. Right? So that's a way we can share. So we are not both doing, I don't have to do TikTok, which I don't have the resources to do, and Wake Up doesn't have to do the original, reporting or commentary work that I've already done, right? We can just share it that way. And I think, the GE will be one test of whether this is a workable system, because there will be no time and there will be no resources, and we cannot afford to have all of us trying to reinvent the wheel all the time, right? We need to start to share resources. If there are things that I have, I can share, and vice versa, right? So I think that's one way, and I think the future of the media industry is a big question mark, not just in Singapore, but globally. If you've paid any attention to like journalism and media industry news, you will constantly these days, this year, be hearing stories of newsrooms downsizing, publications closing, journalists getting fired. So right now, I'm very lucky that I have like a more regular gig, because if I didn't, actually, I would say more than 50%, more than 60% of the freelance outlets that I used to write for as a full-time freelancer are either shut down or no longer in a position to pay people for their contribution, right? So I would not be able to make the living that I used to make if I went back to try to do the freelancing that I used to do. And so I think that's like a global problem. Part of it is a capitalism problem. Part of it is a market problem, a new cynicism problem. And in Singapore, it's got an added because in Singapore, it's not like there is no money for news, right? It's just that 900 million of it is going to one place. Yeah, so then I feel like at the rate it's going, that sort of fragmentation that Koki mentioned will continue to happen, right? Because it will increasingly come down to Singaporeans trying to do our own little things and, not being able to, it will be very hard. Like, I think even with Nimbus's best efforts, we can acknowledge that we will not be able to rival the resources of the 900 million SPH media sort of setup. So it would be very difficult to do that unless something massively changes politically. I think in Singapore, it's not as simple as a market problem. It's also a very big political problem.
I think for me, how I would answer that is when we did the Independent Media Fair last year, and I would tell people about it before it happened, that we were going to have booths by different independent media outlets. They would be like, so you'll have 4 booths? Like, it'll be a really small fair. And, they would just think of like the few usual suspects. But I think if Nimbus is successful and if my hope is that in 20 years, it would be like self-evident that there would be a thriving community of independent media, and that people would have that on the top of their minds, and they would know who would be at the Independent Media Fair, and that would be obvious. Yeah.
And be willing to financially support them.
Yeah. 900 million.
I think with 1% of the budget, we can do wonders. Yeah. I actually don't see TikTok as a very bad thing, right? Like, I think it's actually we can embed TikTok into our contents or work together. So essentially, I feel that a lot of young people these days, right, they don't even Google search anymore. They just search on TikTok, like flooding at my condo, Singapore flooding condo, Singapore flood. They will just search on TikTok. So, and it's a very normal thing, and I think that like the instincts of a newsroom or media outlet has to change. So like last time, let's say there's something happening, right? You send your guy down to write, and then he writes, and then he comes back and whatnot, right? But I think now, concurrently, you also need to send your video team down. That means as your written piece is being produced, your video has to come out at the same time, right? And then, sorry, I don't think you have to worry much. There's like stuff like this app called CapCut, where like your video is already made, right? Just one button, and then the captions are there. You just have to like have a quick second look, yeah. So. And I think that that's one of the things that Nimbus, I can share this right now, yeah. What we intend to do is to basically, we have many good content creators in the form of writing in Singapore, even amongst Nimbus members, right? So one thing that we intend to do before the elections is like have in-house workshops, right, on how we can convert an article into video without even somebody sitting there. So they got the AI voiceovers, and then you'll play over some guy running around in Minecraft. So like some very like how to say, like visually appealing things, like balloons bursting, and then like water balloons bursting, and then at the side is like, okay, the text will come out, like an AI voice will read it out, right? Or how we can try to, okay, let's say you have this 5,000 word article, okay? Let me pick out 5 paragraphs and read it out, and then put captions, and then try to basically repackage your well-written content for a mass audience. So that's something that we are trying to do in-house lah. And then if it works, or even something simple like a lot of TikTok content is like you speaking and then your article is just scrolling up at the background. So you give a summary, like say, okay, so this, and then what do you think? You know, that sort of thing, yeah. So I think the... Oh, no, not to avoid pop mic, just like...
Just end everything with a question mark. You're safe, yeah.
Yeah. So like, one beautiful thing about TikTok, right, is that you can have a very big setup with like $10,000 cameras and whatnot, but one guy in a car who is like scolding somebody, you know, will do much more viral. So in a sense, right, it's a very democratic space. So I mean, I think we should be thinking about how we can use TikTok for our own things. And the great thing about TikTok is that the same video you can share on FB and IG and whatnot, you know, because the algorithms push and recommend similar type of content. So yeah, I mean, if our in-house workshop thing works out, then I think we can open it up, yeah, hopefully.
So exciting times. Looks like the next GE 24 or 25 will be covered in a way like never before.
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
So